Okay, so this is the third video lecture on the chapter of social class in the United States. In the last video lecture, I was talking about power, right? Power and prestige. And now I'm going to pick up with talking about some of the sociological models of social class. So some of this should sound familiar, right? Some of this we talked about in the previous lecture, specifically Marx, right? But obviously this is a really important concept, right? There will be a quiz and exam question about what is meant by the relationship to the means of production. I think I spelled that right. And so the means of production is how you make money, right? Is the wealth, the factory, the houses, the store, whatever, the means of production. And what is your relationship to it? Means, do you own it or do you work in it? So Marx's theory had two social classes. You were the owner of the means, you were the owner of the factory, or you came to the factory to work, right? You were an owner or worker. Or sometimes I'll use the example of a pimp and a prostitute, even though it's not a very good example. Now, Eric Wright expanded on his theory, takes the same basic idea of the means of production, but Wright suggested that it was a little bit more complicated than that, because he said that some people could have what he called not dual class locations, but they could be both a worker and an owner, right? So for example, and so he expanded it. He expanded it and says there were at least 4 social classes. But a worker and an owner would be an example of somebody who is a small business owner, that they own the factory, but they also work in the factory. They own the bakery and they work in the factory, right? So are they an owner or are they a worker? Well, they're both. Or you could have an example of the managerial class. And I think we talked about this another time in another slide, but the managerial class is both exploited and exploiter. So the manager, what separates the 4 classes is if they own the means of production, or if they sell their labor, or if they control people. So for instance, the managerial class would both sell their labor to the capitalist class, but they would also control the labor of others. They would control the labor beneath them. So Wright is considered a Marxist. He's considered a Marxist from this perspective, but he said that there were 4 social classes. And he added the managerial class. If you've ever been a manager and you were both like yelled at from the boss, but maybe even people at the bottom didn't like you very much, or if you're a petty bourgeois, I just think that's a fun word to say. Once again, we're going to talk a little bit about Weber. Instead of me actually typing out the words for this one, I just stuck the same ladder that is in your textbook. This is sort of a standard sociological image that you see. But you'll remember that Weber had that index, right? He had not the index, he had the index, the social economic index, and he had the 3, the power, the property, and the prestige. And so, and if we use his theory, if we use his conception of social class, it breaks down into about 6. And still you have the working class, right? Or I'm sorry, still you have the capitalist class, right? Those are still the owners, what does it say? Characterized by investors, top executives, and what it puts their income at $1 million. That's silly because it's way more than that, right? Then you have the middle class, right? But the middle class, according to this model, breaks it down. You have an upper middle class and a lower middle class, because certainly the folks that are making $125,000 are not, their lives are different than those making about 60. Then you have the working class. And I have to admit that it took me a while to conceptualize what exactly a working class is. But think of the working class as the workers, the ones that do the work, right? The other classes supervise the work, but the working class is the ones that do the work, the work of the work. They're the ones that work in the factories, that drive the trucks, that fix the cars. There's this term called the salt of the earth, and the salt of the earth are the workers, right? This country could not run without the workers. So I have a very sentimental, a very romantic notion about the working class, because they're the ones that know how to get stuff done. They're the ones, and often, the capitalists and the professionals and the managers, they can't do the work. They can't actually do the job. They just tell people how they think they should be doing the job. So I kind of think about what we do here at technical colleges as we train the workers, right? This is a place for working class people. And then below the working class is a group called the working poor. And the working poor are folks that work, but don't work in wages and jobs that pay a livable wage. As I say, some high school, some college, $20,000, laborers. Sometimes they call these folks low skilled, which I think is, or unskilled work, which I think is a terribly incorrect description. People like roofers and painters, if you've ever done any of that work, there's skills involved. So I don't think that's fair to use that term. But what it may refer to is these are uncredentialed workers. These may be workers that don't have to have a certain credential or a certain official training, which, going back to the previous discussion about prestige, would explain why they have lower prestige, because you don't have to have an education to do them, right? And let me be very clear. Prestige and one's social class rank does not translate into more importance, right? I'll just be very straightforward about my critique of functional theory, is that this does not mean these people are more or less important. Okay. Yeah, and then then at the bottom is a group that we refer to as the underclass. One of the assignments that you are invited that I ask you to do is watch a video about a woman named Tammy. And if you haven't already seen that assignment, Tammy is a member of the underclass. Underclass people. This scale says that they're maybe unemployed part-time, but not necessarily. Maybe Tammy would be working poor because she works. But sometimes they refer to them as the invisible workers, because they're the temp workers that get hired. They're like the last one's hired, the first one's fired. Those kind of, maybe you should delete that. Maybe Tammy is not. You tell me, you think she's underclass or working poor. Okay, now I could go on for a long time talking about this particular slide, and partly because I don't know why. I used to teach an introduction to social work class, and bulk of social work's clientels are poor people, right? And I don't really like the language that's used in your textbook. Your textbook calls it consequences of class. I guess that's true. I guess these are consequences of class, but this is a list of some, not all, because effectively social class affects everything. It touches every aspect of our life, because because we live in a capitalist economic based society. If you don't have economic resources, you don't have the same kinds of choices in our culture than if you do have economic resources, right? So, gosh, do I have enough? Yeah, okay, so physical health. Our culture, though we have something called the Affordable Health Care Act, and we can buy health insurance on the economy, healthcare is not considered a right in our culture. It's something you have to pay for. It's not something that you are entitled to because you are a citizen. Under this is also food deserts, the availability of food. You've heard lots of stuff maybe in the news about people's access to food. Food deserts, I hope they have the right spelling of that word, is when, and it's usually rural or it can be urban poor, but it's places where there is not a grocery store, say, within a short distance. Mental health care is not something, if we're not guaranteed access to healthcare, we're certainly not guaranteed access to mental health care. It's something that is very expensive. I don't know if you've ever had to pay for a therapist or you know what they cost, but to get mental health care can be as much as $125, $180 an hour. Family life is variable. There are some social class patterns in terms of family life. We've talked a little bit about some of these when we were talking about socialization, but one term that I want to mention here is this term called the marriage market. And your marriage market, I was going to fix that typo there. Your marriage market refers to the people that you associate with, that you could potentially have a romantic partnership with. So they would be like your peer group, the people you work with, the people you go to school with. And certainly parenting and styles are also influenced by social class. You know, you can't, if you have nothing to buy your child, you can't take anything away. If they don't have, you know, a ski trip coming up or over spring break. Education, for all of you out there know that it costs money to take college classes, and the cost of education has only gone up in the last, well, has only gone up, right? Access to technology, we sure saw that when everyone was sent home to do online learning, that we saw very clearly that if you don't have money to have a laptop or to pay for your internet, you can't access your education, right? Religiosity and church membership is also something that's influenced by social class. We talked about here's the steeple and here's the people. What church you belong to can be predicted by social class. For instance, wealthier people are more likely to belong to the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. But here's an interesting thing. When asked about religiosity, and religiosity is how religious, how expressive you are in terms of religion, poor people actually claim more religiosity. Wealthy people may have memberships, but they don't necessarily go to church. They don't participate in religious life the same way that poor people, because very often religious membership is a social connection. It is an aspect of social capital. That's where they meet their business partners. It's not where they go to find comfort from the divine. Politics, we're going to maybe get to a whole chapter on politics. Who do you think votes for more? Who do you think votes more, wealthy people or poor people? Well, I'll answer that question. It's wealthy people, right? They're more likely to vote, and there's a pretty clear pattern that wealthier people are more likely to vote Republican than Democrat, right? And then the criminal justice system, what's the question? Who's more likely to be a victim of violent crime, the rich or the poor? It's the poor. Poor people are more likely to steal from other poor people. Poor people don't come into wealthy neighborhoods and steal from wealthy people. They steal from each other. Whereas wealthy people participate in a different kind of crime. And one way to think about it is that wealthy crime is a private crime. It's often behind closed doors, in secret. It's maybe on paper. And when poor people commit crime, because it costs money to pay for privacy, that their crime is usually in public spaces, right? And I'm going to stop that, right? I'm going to stop this lecture video right now.